After some of Blackwater's men killed 17 unarmed civilians at a traffic stop in Baghdad in September, Eric Prince, the former Navy commando who founded the company, was called to testify.
To the extent there is any loss of innocent life ever, let me be clear that I consider that tragic. Every life, whether American or Iraqi, is precious. I stress to the committee and to the American public, however, that I believe we acted appropriately at all times. I am prepared to answer your question.
What's your explanation for why it took 8 months and a number of 17 or more civilian deaths at the hands of Blackwater guards before you could finally get him here?
That's a good question for us, but it's also a good question for the State Department. Why did all those people, innocent Iraqis, get killed by people from Blackwater, which obviously has had to have an impact on the Iraqi people when they see a private military that they don't distinguish between our regular military. They just know Iraqi civilians are getting killed by American military people, and the ones in charge at the State Department, the only thing they thought to do was to try to cover up the killings.
Mr. Prince, you do admit that Blackwater personnel have shot and killed innocent civilians, don't you?
No, sir, I disagree with that. I think there's been times when guys are using defensive force to protect themselves, to protect the package they're trying to get away from danger. There could be ricochets. There are traffic accidents. Yes, this is war. Since 2005, we've conducted in excess of 16,000 missions in Iraq and 195 incidences with weapons discharge. In that time, did a ricochet hurt or kill an innocent person? That's entirely possible. But again, we do not have the luxury of staying behind to do that terrorist crime scene investigation to figure out what happened.
Were you satisfied with Eric Prince's responses?
He gave a very self-serving testimony to us. I can understand that that's what he wanted to do. That was in his interest to do it. But I don't think he was responsive or was willing to ever acknowledge that there were problems. And there were very serious problems with Blackwater in Iraq.
How could this happen? You've paid Blackwater over $800 million. Didn't anyone, didn't you or your subordinates ever stop to ask whether or not the legal framework was in place to hold these contractors accountable for its actions? The military certainly is, when there is error committed. How could this have happened?
First of all, this is not just a problem for State Department contractors. We have a lot of contractors working in Iraq, and we want to make sure there's a proper legal framework. But I don't think that it is proper to say that they were above the law. I've just told you that one of the case that was just referenced has in fact been referred to the Justice Department. We continue to believe that the tightening of that framework would make a great deal of sense, and we want to work for that legislation.
Condoleezza Rice came here and conceded that there was a hole in the law as it applied to Blackwater. Do you know if that hole has been repaired?
We're not sure. When a Blackwater military person commits a crime, they're not accountable under Iraqi law. They're not accountable under military law. So the question is, are they accountable under U.S. law? And there's still an open question about that because they're not committing a crime in the U.S. itself. So the House of Representatives passed a bill to say that they would be held accountable under U.S. law. I don't think the Senate has passed that bill. And the Justice Department, the FBI particularly, is doing an investigation. The Justice Department said they may bring criminal charges. They haven't yet, and when they do, and when they get convictions, we'll see what the courts have to say as to whether they're going to be held accountable under U.S. law.
And yet Blackwater's still getting millions of dollars in government contracts. And just a couple of weeks ago, they hired a big lobbying firm here in Washington to go after more contracts. What does that say to you?
Now they want to do more private intelligence gathering. Well, I don't know. We've had enough problems with intelligence by the CIA, but at least they're accountable to us. I'm not sure what it's going to mean for Blackwater being the agency to get intelligence for the U.S. government.
Yeah, if you go back to your district and you go down to the local diner or the cafe and you have a cup of coffee and a guy sitting there and he says to you, Congressman Waxman, I mean, what do you make of Blackwater? I mean, what's your answer?
Well, I don't understand why we're contracting out military operations for this country. A soldier that's working for Blackwater is answerable to Blackwater, which is answerable to its shareholders. American soldiers are answerable to the Constitution and the American people.
The State Department is contracting out huge construction projects in Iraq as well. One such contractor, called First Kuwaiti, has a reputation that is hair-raising. Is it true that the State Department in Iraq hired a Kuwaiti company that's under investigation for kickbacks and bribery as well as using slave labor?
It's true. And they had information about it, and should have known about it, and yet they went ahead with the contract anyway. And that's the company that did such a terrible job on building this new embassy in Baghdad.
With no competitive bidding, the State Department gave First Kuwaiti $600 million to build the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, the largest and most expensive embassy in the world. This American fortress is now behind schedule and over budget, to the tune of an additional $144 million. But that seems almost mundane compared to the testimony of Rory Mayberry, an American medic hired by First Kuwaiti.
I believe I am one of only a few Americans that have recently worked on the site of the new embassy in Baghdad. My impressions about how the construction was being managed left me incredibly disturbed.
Mayberry described how he boarded a plane in Kuwait City along with 51 Filipino laborers who thought they were heading for hotel jobs in Dubai.
Well, Mr. Chairman, when the airplane took off and the captain announced that we were headed to Baghdad, all you know what broke out on the airplane. The men started shouting. It wasn't until the security guy working for First Kuwaiti waved an MP5 in the air that the men settled down. They realized that they had no other choice but to go to Baghdad. Let me spell it out clearly. I believe these men were kidnapped by First Kuwaiti to work on the U.S. Embassy. They had no ID, no passports, and were being smuggled past U.S. security forces. I had a trailer all to myself on the green zone, but they were packed 25 to 30 a trailer, and every day they went out to work on the construction of the embassy without proper safety equipment. I saw guys without shoes, without gloves, no safety harnesses, and on scaffolding 30 feet off of the ground. Their toes were wrapped around the rebar like a bunch of birds.
Despite being paid $500 million in U.S. funds, First Kuwaiti refused to send an official to testify.
Mr. Krongard, we want to welcome you to our hearing today.
Howard Cookie Krongard was the State Department's own Inspector General, the person Secretary of State Rice trusted to expose serious problems. Krongard was called before the committee after his own staff complained he was not rigorously pursuing a growing mountain of complaints, from shoddy construction to human trafficking to Blackwater.
Your role as Inspector General is to investigate waste, fraud, abuse in the State Department. But your office has not completed any investigations into Blackwater activities.
Cookie Krongard's failure to investigate Blackwater really tripped him up.